Deborah Lipstadt, after the trial was over, went on speaking tours around the world, and she's still doing it now, 7 or 8 years later. Her dog and pony show is going around city after city and country after country, in which she acts the part of the dragon slayer, how she slew David Irving, the historian, and destroyed my career and reputation and all the rest of it. I don't think she has. One very interesting remark she made, however, was when she was speaking in Israel to an audience there. She said, "We did all we could to destabilize David Irving before the trial began." Well, you can recognize that if you ever come up into my archive room, have a look at the boxes of papers there. You will see that in the final 10 days before the trial began, literally in the final 10 days, they dumped huge quantities of paper on me. Ring binders full of thousands of pages of documents that I was supposed to read before the trial began. Of course, I had no hope of reading these documents. A month before the trial began, they actually changed their entire defense. They threw out the defense they had originally served 5 years earlier and replaced it with this new defense, which basically centered on smearing my name. And then instead of, I suppose I should have gone to the judge at that point. This was a mistake I made. I should have gone to the judge, Mr. Justice Gray, and say either we have to delay the trial now by 6 months to give me time to read all these new documents, or you as judge in charge of this courtroom have to tell the defendants they've had their chance and they're not permitted to change their defense just 1 month before the trial begins. This is one of the mistakes I made. You make mistakes when you're a litigant in person. I didn't realize you could do that kind of thing. But remember what she said. We did all we could to destabilize him. So let me just come back to describe my family. There's a reason for this. By the time the trial began, I had 4 beautiful daughters. I now have 5 daughters. My daughters were born to my wife, who was born to a noble family in Spain, and they're scattered around the world now. 2 of them in Madrid, and 1 lives in Australia. And the 4th, the oldest child, Josephine, our darling Josephine, was dead. She was born in 1963. She was born in the same month that my Dresden book appeared. She was born on April the 1st, 1963, and my book, The Destruction of Dresden, appeared on the last day of that month. We called her Josephine Victoria because April the 1st is not April Fool's Day in Spain, it's the day of victory, the day celebrating General Franco's victory over the communists. So we called her Josephine Victoria. Now she was dead. At the age of about 18, it turned out that she had an incurable disease. It was a desperate disease, a disease that could be treated but not cured. It was a brain disease. We had noticed something going gradually wrong over the years before that, and over the following 18 years of her life, until the time she was in her mid-30s, the disease got worse and worse, and she was living in Covent Garden, and she found a husband, a fiancé, and I'm glad to say that a year before the end she actually married him. She had a son, Tony. Tony is now a British Army rifleman. I'm very proud of him. Last year he was given a mention in dispatches for saving the lives of 2 of his comrades in Iraq. He has served 4 tours in Iraq, and now he's in Afghanistan serving his 3rd tour in Afghanistan. I placed a copy of the mention in the dispatches in the drawer containing the ashes of his mother. We're a close family. When she realized that she was incurably ill, Josephine gradually began to decline. She was a beautiful child, very clever. I'd noticed something very bright about her in the very earliest years of her life. She was so clever that she jumped a whole year at the French Lycée in South Kensington, which possibly put an added strain on her brain, I don't know. In 1996, the year that my book on Dr. Goebbels was published, I might mention that I'd been in Moscow in the KGB archives, and I was the only historian to have found the private diaries of Dr. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. I was the only person who could read them anyway in his handwriting, and I brought them back and I published the diaries, the biography of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, called Goebbels, the Mastermind of the Third Reich, and it was published in 1996 in Britain. It was never published in America because Deborah Lipstadt had put pressure on my publishers, St. Martin's Press, and on all the publishing journals in the United States, Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and the rest, not to publish any more books by me. My publisher in America had resisted this pressure for 6 weeks as they said, we're not going to surrender, and I thought to myself, yes, you will, and eventually they did. That was 1996. In the beginning of May 1996, I got a fax from my publishers in Mountains Press telling me that they were not going to publish a book after all. Deborah Lipstadt was to blame for that. But I was overshadowed by a far crueler event that happened that month. Josephine, my oldest daughter, tried to kill herself. A brave doctor in the London hospital had saved her life, had operated on her for 14 hours, had unfortunately been left with no choice after a few days but to amputate her limbs. And for the remaining 2 years of her life, 3 years of her life, poor Josephine lived in a wheelchair with no legs, her back broken, and her limbs, her arms shattered. She was a lovely girl. She came round to see me in 1999, about 4 months before the trial began. Her husband wheeled her round from Covent Garden, where she lived, and she came to visit me in Mayfair. I'm very proud of her. She frequently visited me. She couldn't come up in the elevator anymore because the elevator was too small for her wheelchair. We had a chat. She was talking about buying a car and would I pay for the insurance for her, and all the things that passed between a daughter and her father. And on an instinct, just before she left, I said to my secretary, a legal assistant, I'd hired two law students as assistants. I said to Catherine, would you just run upstairs and get my camera, please? And I had Catherine take a picture of me standing next to Josephine outside our front door. I never saw her again. A few weeks later, she succeeded where she'd failed before and killed herself. I suppose the pain was unbearable, and it was a desperate day for me. I was sitting in my office when my sister phoned with the news. You're going to wonder why I'm mentioning all this in connection with the Lipstadt trial. Well, you then have a week, which I suppose is the worst week in a father's life. You telephone around the world to all her sisters and break the news to them. And then you have the awful preparation of the funeral. She was a Catholic. We had the funeral ceremony in the most beautiful Catholic church in Mayfair. And my family came in from all around the world. And the church was full. She had many friends. I had no notion of all the family friends, all our friends, and all her friends from the Covent Garden area where she lived. And that afternoon I went back to my study. We had a reception, and then everyone left and I was alone. And the telephone rang. And it was the undertakers. A wonderful firm of English undertakers who I'd had to contact a week earlier. I mean, when you're a father, you're not accustomed to this, bearing your own children. And they knew this, and they said, Mr. Irving, you need have no worries. We handled the arrangements for Admiral Lord Nelson, you know. And they phoned that afternoon after the reception, after the funeral, after I'd kissed the coffin goodbye. And they said, Mr. Irving, something rather odd has happened. A wreath has been delivered here, and it's too late for the service. What shall we do? And I said, well, tell me, is there a card attached? They said, yes, there's a card attached, and it's a very expensive wreath. It must have cost many hundreds of pounds. It's white lilies and white roses. I said, well, please send it round straight away, because I will have to thank the people who sent the wreath. And the wreath was delivered by a courier an hour later to my front door. It never came upstairs. I read it and the card downstairs in the street. And I went upstairs and got a camera and took a photograph of the card. The card read in German, I'm sorry, I took a photograph of it. The card read, truly a merciful death. And the signature was Philip Buhler and Friends. That would mean nothing at all to anybody who didn't know the history of the Nazis and the Third Reich. Merciful death, Gnadentod, was the German, the Nazi euphemism for for euthanasia, killing the disabled. Philip Buhler, who had apparently signed this card, had been dead since 1945. He was Hitler's left-hand man. He was head of the euthanasia program. He killed himself in 1945 at the end of the war. This was a nasty little smear been sent by somebody with more than enough money to spare, aimed at destabilizing me 2 or 3 weeks before the trial began. It was the nastiest thing that has ever happened to me. I'm not going to say that Deborah Lipstadt herself was personally involved in this. I was sufficiently worried by this that I took a photograph of the card because I thought it may be just a smear wreath today, a hate wreath today, tomorrow it may be a pipe bomb. So I took a photograph of the card before I destroyed the wreath. I phoned the undertakers. They were very shocked. They said, "We can't understand how this happened, sir. It came from the Bloomsbury florists." I visited the Bloomsbury florists that afternoon, and as I came away from them, they were very embarrassed, of course, and very shocked. And they sent around a wonderful wreath of flowers afterwards. And they said that the man who bought this wreath, the white wreath, the roses and the lilies, he looked like he had a Middle Eastern appearance. He looked very wealthy. He was very well dressed. As I walked away from the shop, I found myself passing the front door of Deborah Lipstadt's lawyers 100 yards away. It was a very unpleasant experience. The trial lasted 3 months, but I never ever forgot what had happened to Josephine and the use to which my enemies had put it. I'm not going to go into the details of the trial here because it's too complicated to go into. But it was a very unpleasant experience. Any parent who's lost a child will know what I went through. I was destabilized for many weeks afterwards.